Hey, I'm Jamie from Stonemaier Games, and today I'm here for not really a top 10 or a top 15 video, but really a video about how some games, particularly Magic the Gathering and how that might be applied to tabletop games, allow you to play certain cards for free. Or whatever the game is. I'm going to use the word card here, but whatever you're trying to play or put into play or buy in a game, sometimes games allow you some workarounds, some loopholes to get the card for free. Again, I'll use the word card here for this video. And I think this is a fascinating area of design because it feels really good when you pull it off. Or for me at least it does, where I can see that normally this card has this really high cost, but I have hacked my way into the loophole that's featured on the card itself or elsewhere in the game to not have to pay anything for it. I think that's really, really cool. And Magic, I think, does this really well in a variety of categories. So I'm going to talk about specific Magic cards and how they might apply to other tabletop games that have things that you're playing that have a cost. So I'm using, thanks to Scryfall.com. I'm looking over my other monitor here at some examples on Scryfall.com. And thank you to Stonemaier Games ambassadors for helping me populate this list. The first category are cards that actually just have a 0 mana cost. And for Magic, obviously for this discussion, I'll be using mana cost as the reference. But again, I think this can apply to any tabletop game where you have something that you're trying to play or buy that has a cost, whether that cost is mana or money or resources, whatever it may be. So in Magic, the most streamlined example of this are cards that literally have a 0 mana cost. And the classic example that comes to mind for me when I think of this is the Ornithopter. Ornithopter is a 0/2 flying artifact creature that has a 0 mana cost. So right away on your first turn, even if you have no mana to spend, you can play that Ornithopter. This is definitely the most basic version of this example because Ornithopter's cost is 0. It isn't that you are finding a loophole or working around a much higher cost. Instead, the cost is just 0. And the challenge here is that the Ornithopter, as a 0/2 flying creature, doesn't really do much on its own. It's a basic wall at most, at best. And so the challenge here, I think, is deciding what other cards to go in the deck to make this 0 cost card worth playing. So I think this is interesting. This idea, if you have a game where most things have a resource cost, to include something that has no cost, that you can play for free just because that's the cost, but have it not serve much of a function unless you combo it with other things, like in Magic, say, equipment, where it might provide some sort of utility for what you're doing. The next example I have is the keyword Affinity. The classic use of Affinity is Affinity for artifacts, but this has been applied to other cards since then. What this means is, here, I'll read it out loud. This spell costs one colorless mana less to cast for each artifact you control. So simply by controlling other cards in your tableau, other permanents in Magic, of this specific type, artifacts, this card costs 1 less to play. And the example that I have is the Frogmite. Frogmite is a 2/2 creature that costs 4 mana, which is a lot for a 2/2 creature normally. But because of Affinity for artifacts, this creature can potentially cost 0. If you have 4 artifacts in play and you have the Frogmite and you want to play it, the mana cost is essentially reduced to 0. You get to play this 2/2 creature for free. And I think this is really cool that you have a slightly overcosted card where simply by looking at cards that you've already played in your tableau of a specific type, those cards can potentially reduce the cost of the card you're trying to play to 0. Next up, we have a card that's somewhat similar, but it does require you to actually do something. And this is the keyword Convoke. Convoke says your creatures can help cast this spell. Each creature you tap while casting the spell pays for 1 mana or 1 mana of that creature's color. And the example I have is Stoke the Flames. This is a card that normally costs 2 colorless and 2 red, but and its effect is it's an instant. It does 4 damage to any target. This is pretty cool, right? 4 damage to any target as an instant is great, especially if you can reduce that cost to very little or 0. And all you have to do is tap at least 2 red creatures and 2 other creatures. And so it's essentially using creatures as mana for this purpose to cast this type of spell. I think this is great too. So it's a little bit more than Affinity. You need to have these cards in your tableau and you need to actually use them. You need to basically use cards that you haven't already used that turn, that you haven't already tapped, you haven't already attacked with. But you can use, it creates it gives a functionality to a type of card in the game that isn't usually associated with that type of card. Usually in Magic, lands are used to generate mana. But essentially here you are using any card in your tableau, any creature, not any permanent, any creature to generate that mana instead. That's pretty cool. I like that idea. Convoke. Next up, we have Pact of the Titan, the Pact cycle. Yeah, this is one of my favorite cycles, and I think this has been expanded a little bit since Future Sight was, I believe, the set that it was in. Time Spiral Remastered, I think it was and Future Sight, yeah. Future Sight was my favorite sets in Magic because it experimented in so many different ways. Pacts are zero-cost cards, kind of like that Ornithopter that I mentioned earlier. Cost nothing to pay it. This Pact of the Titan says create a 4/4 red giant creature. So that's awesome. Create a 4/4 creature for 0. What's the catch, right? The catch is, at the beginning of your next upkeep, pay 4 colorless and 1 red, and if you don't, you lose the game. This is really cool. So it's a delayed cost. So you need to pay the cost eventually, or you need to win the game at this very moment. But it costs 0 at the moment. It is a card that you would usually cost much more than that, but it costs 0 in this moment. And there are 2 things that combo with it really well, or that don't combo with it, but that make this work. One, that there is a delayed cost, so there is a way to not lose the game, but also the stakes are really high. This is something that you only want to spend if you can't pay that cost. If you know that by playing it, you will win the game, because otherwise you will lose the game if you can't pay that mana cost in the future. I think this is really fun. I had a lot of fun playing with Pacts back in the day. I'm sure I lost plenty of games playing with Pacts. But just the idea that you can give yourself one last chance to survive or one chance to win the game by playing a Pact, I thought was really cool. So in tabletop games, I think this could carry over, where you put really, really high stakes. Doesn't necessarily have to be that you lose the game, but maybe if you can't pay this cost, you lose X number of points. An example maybe is an Anachrony a little bit, where in Anachrony you are borrowing resources from the future, and if you can't pay back those resources when you get to the future, you have a paradox happen, which is pretty costly. So yeah, the Pact cycle I think is a really, really exciting type of card to play around with. Next up, we have Suspend, one of my favorite mechanisms in Magic. And essentially these cards do have a little bit of a cost, but they feel like they're free at the time that they're actually cast. So Ancestral Vision is an example of a Suspend card. It says Suspend 4, and this costs 1 blue mana. So you have to play 1 blue mana, and otherwise this card has no casting cost. So you have to play 1 blue mana, and it isn't to play the spell, it is to suspend the spell. The text says, rather than cast this card from your hand, pay 1 blue mana and exile it with 4 time counters. So you're adding a time cost to it, or time delay to it. At the beginning of your upkeep, remove a time counter. When the last time counter is removed, cast this card without paying its mana cost. And the ability is that you get to gain 3 cards. You draw 3 cards, or target player draws 3 cards. So this is incredible. If you play this on your first turn of the game, over the next 4 turns, you're going to be removing time counters, not having to pay anything to do it, just by having a turn, just by remaining in the game, you get to remove a time counter. And then suddenly on that 4th turn, on the 5th turn, you get 3 cards for free. You draw 3 cards, which is an amazing boost in Magic. I love this idea of Suspend in any tabletop game where you are playing something now, but there is a time delay to when you will gain the benefit from it. Whether or not it has a cost at the beginning, like Ancestral Vision has this 1 blue mana cost. But this time delay where you are advancing towards getting this card faster. And Magic also gives you some ways to remove those time counters a little bit faster to get this benefit faster. I think that's a neat design space to play around with. But the time delay, I think, is a really cool space for enabling players to play cards for free. And that is the Suspend mechanism. Next up, we have one of the most infamous cards in Magic, a card called Force of Will. And so the mechanism here is that you can... I actually forgot a card here. I'll come back to this one in a second. I didn't set this up correctly. Okay, let's do Force of Will for now. So Force of Will says that you need to discard a same color spell and lose a life instead of paying the mana cost. So it gives you an alternative mana cost that also has a high other cost. So it is letting you use cards in your hand and a little bit of life to play this card for free. So normally Force of Will costs 3 colorless and 2 blue mana, which is a lot to counter a spell. I think the standard cost for countering a spell now is 1 colorless and 2 blue. So this is 2 higher than that. But Force of Will gives you a way to surprise an opponent when you don't have any mana available or when you really need to counter something that they're doing by removing a blue card from hand. So you need to have a card of a specific color in your hand and also paying a life. This does 2 things here. It's saying, and I'll actually get back to life later, so let's focus on the discarding a card. But if it is a game where you have things in hand or resources you control, to use those resources in a way that you wouldn't normally use them, sacrificing the use of those resources or that card to play this card for free, it feels very powerful when you do that. And it can really surprise an opponent when you do that. Now the card that I forgot, let's pull this up here, is the Leyline cycle. So this is a different set of cards, the Leylines. So I'm using Leyline of the Meek as an example. This card costs 2 colorless and 2 white. And it says, if Leyline of the Meek is in your opening hand, you may begin the game with it in play. It says creature tokens get +1/+1. So pretty good spell, right? It's worth casting this spell later in the game if you get it and you don't get it in your opening hand. But it's a spell that says, if you have this in your opening hand, you just play it for free. So that mechanism itself is pretty cool. If you have any game where you're shuffling a deck of cards at the beginning of the game and drawing an opening hand, which is the case in many games, perhaps due to Magic's influence, you get to play this card for free. I love this idea of your opening hand, having a surprise in your opening hand that you get to start the game with a little extra boost just by having that card in hand. And yet having this card give you utility later in the game too, if you really need to use it, perhaps at a slightly overcosted, higher cost than you normally would, I think is a really, really interesting design space to look into in a game. Looking at your opening hand, letting players look at that opening hand and giving them a bonus that they have specific cards in that opening hand. Playing from graveyard. So this is I think they're a class of decks called Reanimator decks, because there was a card called Reanimate back in the day. I don't think it's legal in most formats now, but it let you pull a card from your graveyard and put it into play for free. A more modern card is Mizzix Mastery. So this card says, exile target card that's an instant or sorcery from your graveyard. For each card exiled this way, copy it, and you may cast the copy without paying its mana cost. So this is another card that is reanimating a sorcery or an instant. It's saying, pull this card from your graveyard and play it for free. And yes, there is a cost to Mizzix Mastery, so it isn't exactly an entirely free way to play a spell. You're paying some mana. But in most cases, when you use this, ideally you are paying less mana than the actual casting cost of the card. This is basically interacting with a graveyard. So interacting with your discard pile, your graveyard, cards that you've removed from your tableau or your deck. It's a way to look at that and pull one of them back into play. And by doing this, by having this type of mechanism in a game, you almost encourage players to put cards into that graveyard or into whatever that space is in your game that they weren't able to play because they were too expensive. And it gives you a way to pull them back up and feel really good when you pull them out of the graveyard and put them into play using a Reanimator card like this. So engaging with your graveyard or any area where you have discarded cards to, or you've stopped using those cards or those components, I think is a neat way to have free card interactions. Next up is the mechanism Cascade. So here's the Apex Devastator, which just has the Cascade ability. Cascade says when you cast the spell, exile cards from the top of your library. So instead of engaging with your graveyard, you're engaging with your library in a random way. Unless you have control over the top card of your library. Exile cards from the top card of your library until you exile a non-land card that costs less than this card. And Apex Devastator costs 10 total mana. So most likely the card that you take off the top of your deck will cost less than it. You may cast it without paying its mana cost. Put the exiled cards on the bottom of your library in a random order. So this is kind of a little bit of a push your luck mechanism, because you are engaging with your library, which is a random shuffled deck of cards, and pulling cards off your library and hoping to get some really good cards. And this spell happens to let you cascade 4 times. So you're getting 4 cards this way, 4 of any card, any non-land card, which is awesome. I think this is really fun too. So the graveyard, you have control over that. You can see what's in your graveyard. you don't have control over, really much control over your library unless you build into your deck ways to control your library, to control what that top card of your library is. Then you know exactly what you're getting with the Apex Predator. I think this is really cool as well. Lots of games, again, lots of deck building games, for example, give you a little bit of control over that top card of your library, or you don't have that much control. You are maybe pulling a random card from your library. I think this is a really cool mechanism to engage with the randomness of your library and what you might get, the fun of what you might get by playing this Cascade spell. Also, speaking of which, I'm going to go back a little bit. When I was talking about Force of Will, I forgot to mention an example from a game that we published called Wingspan. In Wingspan, there's a card called the Bonelli's Eagle, and there's a few other cards like this. Bonelli's Eagle, like Force of Will, lets you discard cards instead of paying the mana cost. So it says you can replace each of the rodents in the mana cost for Bonelli's Eagle by discarding a card from your hand instead. And I thought of this because with Cascade, there are some cards in Wingspan that let you look at the top card of the deck. And the deck is a shared deck of cards for all players. You don't have your own unique deck. And you're kind of looking for a specific type of card, or you might be looking at the top card of the deck and looking at its Wingspan. And then you might do something with it as a result. Usually you're tucking the card as a result. But I think this is a good reminder to me that you don't have to have your own private deck to do something like this Cascade cost. It could be a shared deck at the table where you're looking through that deck and getting something random and cool from it. Next up we have if you control a specific card. So this is looking at a specific card in your tableau. The example here is the Flawless Maneuver card. It costs 2 and 1 white. If you control a commander, so that's the specific type of card in this case, you may cast this spell without paying its mana cost. Creatures you control gain indestructible until end of turn. So I like that this is a little similar to what we were talking about earlier with Affinity, where it was looking at cards that you already have in your tableau and specific types of cards. This also looks for either a specific type of card or even a specific card. This might say if you have this specific character in play, then that character knows how to use this weapon or use this card, and you just get to play it for free. I think that's a cool mechanism too. It gives you a reason to build a deck around that card, or build a tableau around a specific combination of cards to enable you to play a card like Flawless Maneuver for free. We're in the last 5 here. Again, these are in no particular order, but this is an entirely different type of mana called Phyrexian mana. The example here is the Gitaxian Probe. And this has a mana cost of 1 blue Phyrexian mana, and you can either pay this with 1 blue mana as normal, or 2 life. So I mentioned earlier that with Force of Will, you have to pay 1 life as part of the casting cost. This creates a whole set of cards where you can pay life instead of mana for all or part of the casting cost of a card. Gitaxian Probe says, look at target player's hand and draw a card. So potentially on your first turn or any turn, you can pay 2 life to draw a card if you really want a card, if you think it's worth 2 life. I think this is really, really neat. So whatever the kind of the lose condition is in the game. So in Magic, the lose condition is that you have 0 life. Whatever that condition may be in your game, if that lose condition, if you let players spend against that lose condition, whether it's life, it's health, it's it could be cards in your deck as well, if you're paying cards from your deck. But letting players pay that instead of the standard resource cost can give players a really interesting trade-off, an interesting decision there. Do they spend the standard resource cost, or do they spend the thing that doesn't really matter until you have none of it? And I think that's a really cool decision to present to players. The last visual example I have is Rebound. So Rebound lets you play something again for free. So you've already played it once, you paid a cost, but to play it again, it's free. So Distortion Strike costs 1 blue mana. Target creature gets +1/+0 until end of turn and can't be blocked. Pretty good ability. And it has Rebound. So it says if you cast this spell from your hand, so opposed to using it from your graveyard, exile it as it resolves at the beginning of your next upkeep. So there's a little bit of a delay there, a little bit of time delay, a little bit like Suspend. You may cast this card from exile without paying its mana cost. So this isn't really a loophole or anything. This is just the card saying this: if you cast it normally, you get it back for free. I could see this also being built into a little bit of a loophole. Like if you pay this extra cost, then you get to pay it again in the future. This is very generous that you just get to Rebound lets you play it again in the future at no cost. I could see this working in other tabletop games as well. Cards or components that say play it now for a really cool effect, and then you get to play it again once in the future before getting rid of it permanently, whether you pay an extra cost or simply by playing this card. So I think Rebound is a neat mechanism to play around with. Now I have 3 other examples that I couldn't find examples in Magic. Feel free to let me know if you have specific card examples in Magic that work for these. One is play this card when it's milled. So a mill in a deck like this is when if you like mill one card, it means choose a player, take the top card of their library and put it in their graveyard. And sometimes, in some collectible card games, for example, there are abilities that say, if this card is milled, so if this card is discarded, instead, you get to play it. This leads to a lot of interesting combinations where you might try to put the card, you might find a way to put a card like this on the top of your deck, or rearrange the top cards of your deck, or just hope that you get lucky and put a bunch of cards in your deck that have this milling ability, and then have other cards that mill cards. That can feel really good. The next up is, and I'm sure there's examples in Magic, I couldn't think of this, is sacrifice a creature. So instead of paying the standard mana cost, sacrifice a creature. So look at a creature in your tableau and destroy it. So get rid of it. You were sacrificing something you've already invested in, getting rid of it to play something hopefully better or more effective at that time for free. Wingspan doesn't have an example of this, essentially. So Wingspan has some cards that say that you can cover other cards that you've already played. And if you do so, then you get to play the card for free or at a discount. So this is an interesting trade-off here. You're giving up something that you've already invested in, which can lead to a little bit of a loss aversion. But I think it works really well if you have cards with comes into play effects. So if you have played a card earlier in the game that isn't very good, but it gives you a one-time bonus, like draw a card or gain a little boost at that moment, and then its effect is no longer useful, and you play something, then it becomes like an easy target to play on top of or to destroy or sacrifice later because you've already gotten its main utility out of it. You want something better in place of that card. I think Wingspan does that in a few examples, in a few ways. I've seen other games do that as well. My last example is if an opponent does X. So if another player does something specific, this gives you a reason to pay attention to other players on their turn. If they do something specific, you get to play a card for free. And Clank Legacy has a few cards like this, and maybe even Standard Clank has a few of these as well, where they essentially say, like, if your opponent plays this type of card or does this on their turn, if they draw more than one card on their turn or whatever an example may be there, if they do a specific thing, you get to play this for free, or you could play this for free to even benefit that opponent. So it doesn't always have to be if your opponent does something specific, if they've walked into a trap, but it could also be something that they do that you might try to benefit them in a cooperative game, or if you benefit them, then you get a benefit as well. But I really like this as a reason to pay attention to other players on their turns and watch what they're doing and kind of feel a little sneaky while you're doing so, because you have some information that you don't have in your hand and you're waiting for them to do something so you can do this thing for free. Also gives them a reason to keep an eye out for what you might be wanting to do on your turn. So yeah, these are 15 examples of games in Magic and a few other games where there are loopholes and hacks to play something for free, which to me feels really good when I get to do that. I'd love to hear your examples, whether they're from Magic or other games. Let me know your examples in the comments below. And I'm tempted someday to maybe design an entire game around this where every single card has a cost, but it also has a loophole or a hack around this cost. And I'm sure this list will be helpful or inspiring to me if I end up doing that someday. Also, I have another long-form video about Magic mechanisms, mechanisms in Magic the Gathering that are inspiring to me, specifically keywords. I have a link to that in the description below if you want to check that out. Thanks, and I look forward to the discussion in the comments.